Russia has completed the launch pad at the Vostochny Cosmodrome, one of the most modern and automated in the world. Satellites, modules of the new orbital station, Russian orbital station cargo, and manned spacecraft will be launched from it, and in the future, interplanetary missions as well. Why is such a project considered one of the most complex engineering structures ever created by humanity? And will it be able to replace the complex at the Vostochny Cosmodrome that was damaged during a recent launch? We'll talk about this as well as about the new hero of the week after a brief summary of positive news. Another batch of Su-34 fighter bombers has been delivered to the troops, and another batch of BMP-3 infantry fighting vehicles has been supplied to the forces. Another UTS 800 training aircraft made its first flight as part of testing. In Sverdlovsk region, a full-cycle workshop for the production of titanium ingots has opened. In Moscow. There is production of metal 3D printers, and at Bauman Moscow State Technical University, fiber optic production has started. The Alabuga battery plant has launched the production of next-generation batteries. Nornickel has updated its metallic cobalt production. In Tatarstan, a dairy farm has opened, and in Saratov region, a livestock complex has been launched. At the Vostochny Cosmodrome, the launch pad for heavy-class Angara family rockets has been put into operation, although the first test launch of the heavy Angara A5 was already carried out from it in 2024. It is only now that the pad has been officially commissioned, along with 37 other facilities of the launch complex, including the command post, the technological unit, oxygen and nitrogen storage, evacuation tunnels, and other structures. The area of the launch pad exceeds 45,000 square meters, and the entire complex is much larger. But this is only part of the Cosmodrome, since it already has a launch complex for Soyuz 2 rockets, from which dozens of launches have been carried out. All of this was built in the remote taiga, and the project can undoubtedly be considered one of the most complex engineering structures in the world. There aren't actually that many of them. Only 5 countries in the world have their own cosmodromes: the United States of America, Russia, China, India, Japan, and South Korea. The European Space Agency also has a cosmodrome in French Guiana. Constructing and upkeeping these facilities is challenging and costly. Russia has 2 operational cosmodromes on its own territory, Plesetsk and Vostochny, and 1 former Soviet cosmodrome, Baikonur, which is now located in modern Kazakhstan. We lease it. Each of them has its own specifics. Baikonur was built in 1955 to test the world's first intercontinental ballistic missile, the R-7. The site in the Kazakh steppe was chosen because it was sparsely populated, close to a railway, and relatively close to the equator, which allowed for launching heavier payloads. In 1957, the first artificial Earth satellite was launched from Baikonur, which opened the space era for humanity. And in 1961, the Vostok launch vehicle with the Vostok 1 spacecraft was launched, carrying Yuri Gagarin, the first human in space. Since then, Baikonur has become the main site for manned and commercial launches in our country, but not the only one. Back in 1957, construction began on what would become the Plesetsk Cosmodrome in the Arkhangelsk region. Initially, it was the location of the first Soviet combat unit of R-7 intercontinental ballistic missiles. From here, it was easy to reach the territory of a potential enemy, and it was also convenient to conduct test launches to the Kura range in Kamchatka. However, as early as the 1960s, satellites began to be launched into orbit from Plesetsk, mainly military ones. The world's northernmost cosmodrome proved ideal for launching spacecraft into polar and sun-synchronous orbits. After the Soviet Union ceased to exist, Baikonur ended up on the territory of independent Kazakhstan. And even though we continue to lease it, there was still a need to build a Cosmodrome on Russian territory. That became Vostochny. Because of its northern location, Plesetsk cannot become a full-fledged backup for Baikonur. It's impossible to launch to the International Space Station from there due to unacceptable payload losses, more than double. Therefore, in 2007, as soon as the country recovered after difficult decades, Vladimir Putin signed a decree to build the new civilian spaceport Vostochny. A site for it was chosen in the Amur region. It was considered optimal because the initial section of the rocket's flight path does not pass over densely populated areas of Russia or over the territories of foreign countries. And most importantly, it's convenient to launch spacecraft into the orbit of the future Russian station from here. Russia was building Dimitrorzhok, but constructing such a large-scale project in the taiga turned out to be a difficult task. Multi-ton steel structures were delivered via a complex route through the Arctic Ocean, then along the Amur and Zaya rivers. Despite these and other difficulties, in 2016, the first Soyuz 2-1A rocket was successfully launched from the Vostochny Cosmodrome and put several satellites into orbit. All the efforts were not in vain, and soon the construction of the second phase for Angara rockets began. It was its launch pad that was officially commissioned this week. The launch pad is not just a steel tower, but a complex engineering structure. It is this structure that holds the rocket in a vertical position before launch, allows it to be fueled, and then enables the launch. By deflecting the scorching gases from the engines in a safe direction, the structure has to withstand a tremendous impact. A simultaneous combination of high temperature, acoustic waves, vibration, and the pressure of the jet stream. At the same time, the rocket holding systems during launch must operate with perfect precision. Any deviation carries the risk of losing an expensive mission, and even worse, human lives. 201,000 cubic meters of concrete were poured into the structure's massive foundation pit. The launch pad itself weighs 2,000 tons, and the cable and fueling tower consists of 30 large components that were delivered here by water in 2024. The inspection has been completed. The first test launch of the heavy Angara A5 from the new complex has been carried out, and it was successful. And now the State Commission has officially put the launch pad into operation. But this is not the end yet. At the moment, the second phase of the entire launch complex at the Cosmodrome is being completed, and the construction of a third phase is planned. Let me remind you that the first one was built for Soyuz rockets, the second for Angara rockets, and the third apparently for the reusable Amur rockets, the design of which is still ongoing. The Vostochny Cosmodrome and new rockets will let Russia launch the Russian orbital station and conduct both cargo and crewed missions to it, and also to send interplanetary probes along a fast trajectory, reducing flight time by several times. And most importantly, to back up the Baikonur program, which is especially relevant in light of the recent accident there. On November 27, 2025, a Soyuz 2-1A launch vehicle successfully launched from the Baikonur Cosmodrome, delivering another crew to the International Space Station. However, during the launch, an abnormal situation occurred for some reason, which will be investigated by a special commission, and the service cabin, an important part of the complex, was damaged. Roscosmos confirmed the accident, and since at the moment we don't have another launch site for sending ships to the International Space Station, the logistical connection with the station has been temporarily interrupted. As mentioned, you can't fly to it from Plesetsk. At Vostochny, there is still no necessary infrastructure or spacecraft for the Angara, so only satellites are launched from there. It's not a pleasant situation, but it's further proof of how important it is to have backups. However, the situation isn't critical. The crew change on the International Space Station is scheduled only for July the 14th, 2026, Engineers have 8 months to repair the Baikonur launch complex. According to some reports, a backup service cabin has already been found, which will serve as a donor for spare parts for the damaged one. So there is every chance to make it on time. We'll keep you updated on the events and wish the specialists success. In any case, the commissioning of the launch pad at Vostochny is an important stage in strengthening the sovereignty of Russia's entire space program. There is still a lot to be done, but there is no doubt that we will manage. Next, the announcement and a rescue story. As you know, Russia is capable of producing complex engineering products, from weapons to nuclear power plants and thermonuclear installations. But for some reason, they can't create a modern car. What's the reason? We often get this question from our subscribers. Everyone expects a simple, straightforward answer, and especially wants someone to blame. But as is often the case, reality is a bit more complicated and requires a comprehensive response. Who is responsible for the main financial and engineering resources during Soviet times, directed toward defense and space rather than the consumer sector? Who is to blame for the fact that mass solvent consumer demand began to form in Russia only in the 2000s? The former Soviet auto giants, struggling through the 90s, failed to meet it on time.